Bronze Age. In November 1922, Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb and found two swords lying among the gold. Both were khopeshes, bronze blades curved like sickles but sharpened on the wrong side, and one was forged for a child. And Tutankhamun died around 1323 BC at about 19, so the smaller blade was made when the most powerful ruler on earth was a boy learning to kill. The wrong side is the whole weapon. A sickle cuts on the inside of its curve. The khopesh carried its edge on the outside, so where a straight sword meets a shield edge on, a khopesh reaches around it, hooks it aside, and drops its weight into a chop against the mostly unarmored men of Egypt's battlefields, a weight thrown ahead of the hand. Keep hold of that idea, because it outlives everything else here. Pharaohs had themselves carved on temple walls, gripping enemies by the hair with the khopesh raised overhead. The same pose repeated for 1,000 years. It was the official shape of royal violence. The deadliest blade of the era carried no gold at all. Around 1200 BC, nearly every kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean fell within a single lifetime, cities burning from Greece to the Levant, and in the ruins, archaeologists keep finding the same sword. It's called the Naue Type II, after the Bavarian scholar Julius Naue. The blade is straight, leaf-shaped, and cast in one piece with its grip, so the hilt could not snap off at the rivets the way earlier swords failed mid-swing. It cut, it thrust, and it sold to everyone. Raiders carried it into the burning cities, and the men defending those cities were holding it too. It outlived every kingdom that bought it, crossed into iron without changing shape, and stayed in service for roughly 500 years. The deadliest sword of the Bronze Age was the one that outlived the Bronze Age. Iron Age. Iron ended bronze's monopoly, and the deadliest ideas began moving by theft. In Iberia, smiths bent the sword forward. The falcata curves like a talon, single-edged, its mass gathered near the tip. A sword builds with an axe's intentions, and the old Egyptian idea reborn in iron. When Hannibal crossed into Italy in 218 BC, thousands of his Iberian infantry carried it, and at Cannae 2 years later, it did its share of the work on the worst day in Roman military history, a battle that cost the Republic somewhere near 50,000 men. Ancient writers claimed Iberian smiths buried iron plates and forged only the metal that survived the rust, and later legend added falcatas splitting shields and helmets whole. The stories grew in the telling. The blade underneath them needed no help. Rome's answer was to copy the enemy. The Gladius Hispaniensis, the Spanish sword, entered legionary hands during the wars with Carthage, and in 199 BC, it introduced itself to Greece. Livy records that when King Philip V of Macedon had his dead gathered for burial after cavalry skirmish with the Romans, the gesture backfired. His soldiers, raised on spear and arrow wounds, saw arms taken off at the shoulder and heads separated from bodies, and dread of the Spanish sword moved through the army faster than any charge. For the next 4 centuries, the legions conquered from behind their shields with about 2 feet of steel, thrown in short stabs that traveled inches. The deadliest sword of the Iron Age was the shortest blade on the field. Then the champion met its exception. The Dacian falx was a 2-handed blade curved the opposite way, sharpened on the inside, and in Trajan's wars across the Danube from 101 to 106 AD, it reached over and around Roman shields into helmets and sword arms. The legions answered in iron. Crossbars were riveted across helmet bowls. An articulated steel sleeve called the monica covered the exposed arm. Extra greaves went on, and the reinforcements show up in the evidence from exactly the campaigns against Decebalus and his falxmen. One weapon pushed the best equipped army on earth into redesigning its armor. No other sword here can claim that. Viking Age. Rome's empire fell, but the trade routes stayed open, and along the rivers of the north, the most valuable cargo was steel. A single name appears on roughly 170 blades of this era, found from Ireland to the Volga. All bared, spelled out in iron letters welded into the blade and flanked by crosses. The metallurgist Alan Williams of the Wallace Collection tested dozens of them and found 2 different swords wearing one name. Blades with a cross placed before the final letter were crucible steel, carbon-rich, and almost free of slag, a material no European furnace could produce. It most likely arrived along the Volga routes from Central Asia. Blades with a cross in the wrong position were ordinary iron dressed as the real thing, and some carried enough slag to shatter under a hard blow. Frankish law forbade selling swords to the Northmen. Charlemagne decreed the ban in 805, and Charles the Bald later attached the death penalty, so a warrior often bought his all-bared through smugglers at a fortune's price, with no way to know whether the letters in the steel were a guarantee or an epitaph. The deadliest sword of the Viking Age was a brand, and the counterfeit killed its own customers. Middle Ages. Steel kept improving, and armor improved faster. By the 1300s, a knight in full plate had made the cutting edge nearly irrelevant, and the longsword was the sword that refused to retire. Around 1400, the Italian master Fiore de Liberi wrote the Fior di Battaglia, a combat manual for the court of Ferrara, and in its introduction, he mentions having fought 5 duels with sharpened swords against rival masters, without armor, and won all 5. His system treats the longsword as 3 weapons in one. At distance, it cuts. Against plate, the swordsman grips his own blade halfway down and drives the point like a short spear into the visor slit, the armpit, the joints. Closer still, the crossguard hooks the neck and the pommel lands like a hammer. Some late medieval swords followed this logic to its end. It gave up the edge entirely and narrowed into rigid steel spikes made only for the gaps. The deadliest sword of the Middle Ages treated armor as a puzzle instead of a wall. Golden Age of the East. While Europe armored itself into a corner, the East perfected the cut. The Persian shamshir carried the deepest curve of any sword here, and its surface moved with patterns like flowing water, the mark of a crucible steel the trade called woots, smelted in sealed clay vessels in southern India and Sri Lanka, and shipped west as ingots. 1,000 years ago in Baghdad, the philosopher Al-Kindi catalogued its kind for the caliph, and the most celebrated smith to work it, Asadullah of Isfahan, signed blades that kings collected. Then the steel died. By around 1750, the knowledge chain had broken, the particular ores ran out, and no smith on earth could reproduce it. In 2006, a team in Dresden, led by Peter Poffler, put a genuine blade under an electron microscope and reported, in the journal Nature, carbon nanotubes inside the steel. The smiths had been building structures a millionth of a millimeter wide, centuries before anyone could see them. The Ottomans carried the curved blade to the gates of Europe. Their Kilij was inside Constantinople when the city fell to Mehmed II in 1453, and outside Vienna with Kara Mustafa's army in 1683. Its trick was the Yelman, a widened, double-edged final third that returns mass to the tip, so a drawing slice lands with chopping weights behind it. When the Vienna siege broke and the Ottoman camp was looted, captured Kalijas traveled home in the baggage of half the armies of Europe. Within a century, the cavalry of the men who beat it were carrying its copy. China met a different curved blade and answered with the Changdao. Through the 1550s, Wokou pirate bands, many of them fighting with long Japanese swords, cut through coastal garrisons in Zhejiang and Fujian. The Ming general Qi Jinghuang studied the captured blades, rebuilt part of his infantry around a 2-meter saber of his enemy's pattern, and rolled the drills into his 1560 manual. The Jixiao Xinshu, a serving general, had concluded that the most dangerous sword on his battlefield belonged to the other side, and copied it. The sword was the katana, and here the record gets uncomfortable for the movies. The blade itself earned its legend. Smiths folded tomahawk steel to purge its flaws, coated it in clay, and quenched it so the edge froze glass hard while the spine stayed springy. The Hammond line marking the border between the two. As a cutting instrument, nothing else here touches it. As a battlefield killer, the paperwork disagrees. Japanese commanders required wounded samurai to document their injuries to claim reward, and the surviving registers from the Age of Wars, studied by historians such as Suzuki Masaya, shows arrows end after the arquebus arrived in 1543. Bullets caused the great majority of wounds, with spears behind them and swords down in the long single digits. The katana rolled through those battles as a sidearm, drawn when the real weapons were spent or the fight collapsed to arm's length. So the crown of this era comes with an asterisk. The katana wears it for what it was, not for what it did. Renaissance. Gunpowder was loose in the world now, and the sword began choosing new careers. The Zweihänder chose the loudest one available, a sword as tall as its owner, carried by veteran Landsknechte in the mercenary companies Georg von Frundsberg, led in the early 1500s. Men work in the murderous front yards of pike formations, breaking pike heads and guarding the colors. Tradition says they drew double pay for the job, and tradition may be generous. A battlefield Zweihänder weighed 2 to 3.5 kilograms. The 7-kilogram giants on museum racks were parade pieces, built for ceremony, were the only casualties the man carrying one all afternoon. For 3,000 years, every sword so far was built for a battlefield. From here on, the deadliest blades in Europe stopped going to war. The rapier was a civilian, over a meter of narrow, stiff, thrust-first steel. worn through doorways and to dinner, and it presided over an epidemic. Fencing masters sold the geometry of the lunge like a state secret. In France, Henry IV issued edicts against dueling and pardoned the survivors by the thousand anyway. Between 1589 and 1610, writers of the period put the toll among gentlemen in the thousands, 4,000 by one famous count, a figure contemporaries repeated with something between horror and pride. Europe's nobility had survived plague, war, and religion, and invented a private way to die that required an appointment. The deadliest sword of the Renaissance never enlisted. Age of Empires. The duel refined itself down to a needle. The small sword finished what the rapier started by shrinking into a hollow ground, near triangular blade of about 80 centimeters, light enough to vanish into evening dress, driven by footwork instead of force. It could land several thrusts in the time a saber spent on one, and its small punctures went deep in a world without antisepsis. In Hyde Park in November 1712, the Duke of Hamilton and Lord Moon settled a long lawsuit with small swords and settled it completely. Both men were dead within minutes. While gentlemen perfected killing one man at a time, the pattern 1796 light cavalry saber was built for volume. John Gaspard Le Marchant was a British cavalry officer disgusted by his service's clumsy swords, and he designed it with the Birmingham cutler Henry Osborne. The result was a curved 33-inch blade that widens toward the tip, throwing its weight into the last inches of the cut. Troopers drilled 6 cuts and were told to aim at the face. Reputation says French officers protested the weapon as inhumane. No such complaints has ever been found in writing, and Prussia adopted a copy and named it after Marshal Blucher. George Farmer of the 11th Light Dragoons described a skirmish on the Guadiana in 1811 in a way that stays with you. A comrade's dying blow with a saber split a French officer's helmet and the head beneath it. The wounds needed no paperwork. Le Marchant himself fell at Salamanca in 1812. Leading the cavalry he had spent a career rebuilding. The deadly sword of the age was designed, tested, and mass-produced, an industrial product for an industrial century. World War II. By the 20th century, the sword's work was over, and it kept reporting for duty anyway. From 1934, Imperial Japan issued its officers the shingunto, a katana silhouette around a factory blade, rolled and oil-quenched, produced by the hundreds of thousands, and stamped with serial numbers. The army had been machine-making blades since General Murata Tsuneyoshi's arsenal experiments in the 1890s. By now, the sword was an item of uniform, and the old craft survived inside it about as well as a force survives inside a plank. It was the last combat sword any major army mass issued, and it marched into a war of aircraft carriers. The blade that kept working was shorter. The kukri is the forward-bent Nepalese knife carried by Gurkha soldiers, and it puts its weight ahead of the hand like the khopesh and the fakata before it. Some 30 centimeters of chopping geometry that never needed reinventing. On the 5th of March 1945, on a hill called Snowdon East, near Tamandu in Burma, rifleman Bangbakta Burum of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles was pinned down with his section under sniper and machine gun fire. He attacked 5 enemy positions alone, one after another, uphill, in the open. At the final bunker, he threw in smoke grenades, cut down 2 soldiers with his kukri as they broke out through the smoke, went in after the machine gunner, and silenced the gun. The citation for his Victoria Cross walks through its position by position in the London Gazette's flat administrative prose, and it reads worse than any legend. 8 decades after Tamandu, the kukri is still standard issued in the Brigade of Gurkhas. Every era built a deadlier blade than the last, and every era retired it. The last one standing is a knife from Nepal, and it is still on the belt.